This policy is an absolute outrage and must be condemned in the strongest terms.
You're probably fit. This is an outrageous, unfounded attack on our integrity.
The gavel's echo faded, leaving a silence in the Senate committee room, so profound you could hear the rustle of ambition and the cold whisper of power. All eyes were locked on the two women at the center of the storm. On one side, Senator Lisa Murkowski, a veteran of 2 decades in the political trenches, her face a mask of cool, calculated dismissal. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her authority was woven into the very fabric of the room. With a wave of her hand that seemed to brush away not just a point, but an entire person, she delivered the blow. "With all due respect, Congresswoman Crockett," she said, the phrase a hollow prelude to the insult that followed. "Your brief political career hardly qualifies you to lecture us about long-term infrastructure planning." She let the words hang, toxic and heavy in the air. Then, the final, condescending dagger. "Some of us have been working on these issues since before you passed the bar exam." The silence that followed was a physical force. It was the sound of a trap being sprung, of a hierarchy asserting itself. Cameras swiveled. Every gaze in the gallery sharpened, shifting to the freshman Congresswoman, Jasmine Crockett. For 2 full seconds, an eternity under the blinding lights, she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply sat there, a statue of perfect composure, her expression unreadable, absorbing the insult and the collective gasp that never quite left the crowd's throat. The old guard waited for her to shrink, to apologize, to yield. But then a subtle shift. She leaned forward, a slow, deliberate motion that cut through the tension, and her lips neared the microphone. Her voice, when it came, was measured, clear, and carried a blade of its own. "Senator Murkowski," she began, the room holding its breath. But with just 3 sentences, Crockett was about to shatter that decades-old tradition of deference and rewrite the rules of power in Washington forever. To understand the explosive force of that moment, you have to rewind to the beginning of a hearing that was designed to be forgotten. The title alone was a sedative. Infrastructure Investment Planning for the Next Decade. It was the kind of event that played out in near-empty rooms, a theater of technical jargon where career politicians and bureaucrats discuss funding formulas and jurisdictional authorities with a glassy-eyed detachment. At the center of this entrenched system sat Senator Lisa Murkowski, a queen in her domain. She was settled in her high-backed leather chair, the embodiment of institutional power, surrounded by aides and decades of precedent. This was her natural habitat, and she moved through the preliminary motions with the bored confidence of someone who had already written the script. And into this arena walked Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. She was the outsider, the freshman invited to provide what the chair called valuable perspective. To the old guard, her presence was a formality, a token gesture toward diversity of thought that was never meant to actually disrupt the consensus. She was outnumbered, out-tenured, and in their minds, out of her depth. But as she began her testimony, a subtle shift occurred. She didn't speak in the dry, abstract language of bureaucratic allocations. She spoke of neighborhoods in her district where children drank water from lead-laced pipes, of families where a 3-bus commute was the barrier between poverty and a living wage, of floodwaters that repeatedly devastated the same vulnerable blocks because the maps deemed them low priority. She presented data, yes, but she wrapped it in the stark reality of human consequence. She wasn't just talking about infrastructure. She was testifying about survival. Her words painted pictures of real people, giving a voice to the communities that were usually just footnotes in feasibility studies. For a moment, the room seemed to lean in. A few committee members actually put down their phones, momentarily captivated by this raw translation of policy into pain. But Senator Murkowski's expression remained unchanged. A placid lake of condescension. She wasn't listening to the substance. She was listening for a weakness. She heard a narrative that challenged her legacy, a perspective that threatened to expose the blind spots in her decades of experience. The facts about lead and floodwaters weren't enlightening her. They were annoying her. Murkowski listened, not to understand, but to find the perfect moment to put this upstart in her place. And she thought she found it. But she had just triggered a chain of events she could never have predicted. To truly comprehend the depth of that dismissive wave of the hand, You must understand the fortress that Senator Lisa Murkowski had spent 21 years building. Her public reputation was that of a moderate, a sensible legislator known for her deep, almost encyclopedic knowledge of energy policy and infrastructure appropriations. She had risen through the ranks not on charisma, but on a mastery of process. A virtuoso of the loophole, an architect of the 1,000-page bill where the real power was buried in the appendices. Her career was a monument to itself. Every year in office was another brick in the wall, another layer of insulation between her and the people her policies actually affected. She didn't see the communities grappling with lead in their water. She saw line items in a budget. She didn't see families trapped in transportation deserts. She saw problematic cost-benefit analyses. This was not wisdom, it was calcification. Her experience had become a weapon used to bludgeon new ideas into submission. In the world of Fortress Murkowski, seniority was the only true currency, and legislative tenure was the only credential that mattered. A fresh perspective wasn't an opportunity, it was an inconvenience. Lived experience was an anecdote, while a dusty precedent from a 1998 committee report was gospel. She held her gavel not just as a tool of order, but as a scepter of authority, and she viewed anyone who hadn't paid their decades of dues as a temporary visitor in her permanent kingdom. Her initial questioning of Crockett was a masterclass in this condescending style. It wasn't a dialogue, it was a test designed for failure. "You've painted quite a picture," she began, her tone implying that a picture was all it was, a fantasy not a fact. She spoke of her own work since 2005, a not-so-subtle reminder that she was a player when Crockett was still in law school. Each question was a brick, meticulously laid to wall off Crockett's testimony from the realm of serious policy discussion. She was not engaging with the argument. She was performing a ritual of dominance, a ceremony of seniority meant to put the newcomer back in her assigned place. She was so confident in the impenetrability of her fortress, so sure that the walls of tradition and title would hold, that she never considered what might happen if someone had the key. But across that mahogany table sat a woman whose entire life had been a preparation for this very moment. A woman who knew that the walls of Murkowski's fortress had one critical, hidden weakness. To label Jasmine Crockett's time in Congress as a brief political career was to fundamentally misunderstand the woman. It was to ignore the decade of battle that came before, fought not in the marbled halls of power, but in cramped community centers, in courtrooms where the air was thick with desperation, and on the rain-soaked streets of forgotten neighborhoods. Long before she was a congresswoman, she was a civil rights attorney, and her client was the people. Her journey to that witness table began years earlier, holding the hand of a mother in East Dallas whose child had elevated lead levels, the toxic proof flowing from their own kitchen tap. It was forged during 3-hour bus rides with janitors who left home in the dark and returned long after sunset, their lives devoured by a commute that wealthier suburbs would never tolerate. She had stood knee-deep in the muddy wreckage of a family's home after the third, once-in-a-century, flood in a decade, the stench of loss and neglect clinging to everything. She had held the documents, the official permits and approvals, that had greenlit the industrial project upstream that made these floods inevitable for some and profitable for others. This wasn't theoretical policy for her. It was the scar tissue on her soul. Her legal training was not a placid academic credential. It was a weapon she had sharpened on the grinding stone of injustice. She didn't use it to defend corporations or to climb the partnership ladder at a prestigious firm. She wielded it for popular justice, forcing systems to look at the human damage they caused. She filed suits that made city halls tremble, and she won settlements that finally installed water filters in schools and forced transit authorities to reconsider a bus route. Every data point she presented to Senator Murkowski's committee was stained with the tears and sweat of those she had represented. The number 73% wasn't a statistic. It was 73 families she knew by name, living in 73 homes she had visited, all betrayed by the same cold calculus of inequality. Her move from the courtroom to the Capitol wasn't a career change. It was a strategic escalation. She realized that while she could win battles case by case, true justice required changing the laws that created the inequity in the first place. So she brought the courtroom with her. Her meticulous preparation, her ability to present an unassailable factual record, her calm under pressure. These were the tools of a veteran litigator, not a political novice. She carried the voices of thousands into that room. And when Murkowski attacked her credentials, she wasn't just insulting a congresswoman. She was insulting every single person she had ever fought for. And Crockett was not about to let that stand. The air in the room, once heavy with condescension, now crackled with a new, unstable energy. Congresswoman Crockett's response, "Perhaps that's precisely the perspective you've been missing," was not the shrill rebuttal or the defensive sputter Murkowski had expected. It was a controlled detonation. A low murmur rippled through the public gallery. A wave of audible shock and validation. You could see it in the body language of the other committee members. Spines straightened, chairs creaked as they leaned in, and smartphones were laid flat on the table, their screens going dark. The ritual of dismissal had been interrupted, and the script was being torn up in real time. All eyes swung to Senator Murkowski. The placid, almost bored expression she had maintained throughout the hearing was gone. In its place was a flicker of pure, unguarded surprise. A rapid blinking, a slight tightening around the mouth. The first hairline fracture in her armor of arrogance had appeared. She had thrown a stone, expecting to hit a fragile target, and instead had struck flint, sending sparks flying into the tinder-dry atmosphere of the room. The power dynamic, so rigid and unquestioned just moments before, began to teeter. The junior congresswoman was not cowed. She was leaning into the microphone, her gaze locked on Murkowski, calm and unyielding. The veteran senator, for the first time, looked uncertain, her hand pausing over her notes as she recalibrated. This was no longer a lecture from on high, it was a duel, and the audience had just realized the underdog was armed. The room was electric, teetering on a knife's edge. Everyone could feel it. Crockett wasn't finished. She had defended her ground, but now she was about to launch a counteroffensive that would leave the entire committee stunned into silence. In the breathless silence, Congresswoman Crockett began to speak, her voice a calibrated instrument of clarity that cut through the tension. She didn't raise her volume, she raised the stakes. "With respect to your tenure on this committee, Senator," she continued, her eyes never leaving Murkowski's, "I don't question your experience or dedication." It was a breathtaking maneuver. Extending the respect she had been denied, immediately seizing the moral high ground. "But experience in making policy," she clarified, her words measured and precise, "isn't the same as experience living under that policy." With that single sentence, she completely reframed the conflict. This was no longer a petty squabble about resumes. It was a fundamental clash between the insulated architects of a broken system and the people forced to live in its ruins. She had pivoted from defense to a devastating offense. "The communities I represented as an attorney, and now represent in Congress," she stated, "have decades of experience with the real-world outcomes of infrastructure decisions made in rooms just like this one." She then began to weave a tapestry of undeniable truth, threading her personal history with cold, hard data. "When I talk about water systems that deliver lead-contaminated water to elementary schools, I'm not speaking theoretically. I've represented those schools. When I discuss inadequate flood protection, I've stood with families as they gutted their homes after repeated flooding." Each example was a hammer blow to the abstract, technical facade Murkowski had built. But she was just setting the stage. Then, she unveiled her ultimate weapon, one she had pulled from the Senate's own arsenal. "The funding formulas I'm suggesting adjustments to, the ones you described as carefully balanced," she said, her tone sharpening from narrative to prosecutorial, "have resulted in 73% less infrastructure investment in minority communities compared to other areas with similar population density and tax base." She let the number, so stark and grotesque, hang in the air for a beat. "That's not my opinion, Senator. That's data from the Congressional Research Service, your own research division." The effect was catastrophic for Murkowski. The statistic was a wrecking ball swung directly at the foundations of her authority. She couldn't dismiss it as activist rhetoric. It was her institution's own data, used to indict her life's work. As Crockett detailed the methodology, citing MIT and the Brookings Institution, Murkowski's composure visibly crumbled. The confident senator was gone, replaced by a flustered official shuffling papers, unable to meet the gaze that held her accountable. The power had not just shifted, it had inverted. Crockett, the so-called novice, was now the professor, and the committee, Murkowski included, was her captive audience. She concluded not with a plea, but with a declaration. I haven't come to lecture anyone on their years of service. I've come to ensure that the lived experience of overlooked communities informs your next decades of infrastructure planning. If that perspective seems challenging to the conventional wisdom in this committee, perhaps that's exactly why it needs to be heard. As the final, damning number left her lips, you could hear a pin drop. The old way of doing business had just been publicly dismantled. But the real shockwave was about to ripple out from that room and across the entire country. The silence in the committee room didn't last. It shattered into a digital firestorm that spread across the country at the speed of a click. Before the gavel had even fallen to adjourn the hearing, clips of the confrontation were trending. Hashtags like hashtag Crockett Counterstrike and hashtag 73% exploded on social media, accompanied by viral memes juxtaposing Murkowski's dismissive wave with Crockett's calm, piercing response. It was more than a political moment, it was a cultural reckoning. In living rooms and on smartphones, people saw someone finally talking back to the condescending tone of power, and they leaned in. Political pundits and communication experts tripped over themselves to dissect the exchange, universally labeling it a masterclass. One cable news analyst called it the most effective demonstration of turning privilege into accountability in a decade. But the true shockwave came not from the outside commentary, but from within the belly of the beast itself. As the room emptied, observers witnessed something rare and telling. Senator Lisa Murkowski, gathering her papers with uncharacteristic stiffness, approached Congresswoman Crockett at the witness table. The cameras were off, but the body language was deafening. Murkowski's shoulders were slightly slumped, the imperial posture gone. She spoke briefly, her demeanor shifted from confrontational to conversational. At one point, she even extended a business card, a white flag and an invitation in one. What was said in that hushed exchange remained private, but the consequences did not. 3 days later, a press release issued from Murkowski's own office sent a second, more profound tremor through Washington. It announced the formation of a bipartisan infrastructure equity working group, tasked with examining the very disparities Crockett had laid bare. And there, in black and white, was the ultimate surrender and validation. The release noted that the working group would include Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, whose testimony highlighted significant gaps in our current approach. The very perspective Murkowski had tried to dismiss was now being institutionalized at her own invitation. From a dismissive wave of a hand to a handshake of respect. But was this just for the cameras? Or had this clash of titans genuinely changed the course of American policy? This was no mere public relations truce. The working group became an engine of tangible change, proving that the victory in that hearing room was not just rhetorical, but profoundly real. 6 months later, it produced a groundbreaking report that didn't just document infrastructure disparities. It provided a meticulous blueprint for their eradication. This wasn't a document destined to gather dust on a shelf. Its recommendations were woven into the fabric of new legislation. A water infrastructure bill, a transportation act, a climate resilience package, changing funding formulas that had silently disadvantaged communities for generations. The real proof, however, wasn't in the paperwork, it was in the pipes and the levees. In Oakland, California, a neighborhood that had fought for decades for clean water suddenly qualified for federal funding under the revised, more equitable criteria. In rural Louisiana, a flood protection project that had repeatedly been deemed not cost-effective enough was finally approved, shielding families from the rising waters. These were not abstract wins. They were lives changed, communities made safer and healthier, all because a perspective that had been systematically excluded was finally let in. The moral of the story crystallized into an undeniable truth. Dignity will always, always outlast disrespect. Lived experience is a credential that no institution can grant and no tenure can overshadow. The clash between Murkowski and Crockett revealed that true power isn't demonstrated by silencing new voices, but by having the humility to synthesize them. It demonstrated that the strength of a nation lies not in rigidly defending its past decisions, but in its capacity for course correction. in its ability to look squarely at its own flaws and choose to do better. This is the enduring American spirit, the constant, stubborn striving toward a more perfect union. It's a playbook that extends far beyond the walls of Congress, into every boardroom, classroom, and community where someone is told they don't belong. So the next time someone tells you to wait your turn, to know your place, to respect your elders without question, remember the day Jasmine Crockett looked authority in the eye and taught it a lesson in respect. The diss that backfired did more than just humble a senator, it revealed a timeless truth. Underestimation is not a weakness, it's a weapon waiting for the right hands to wield it. Congresswoman Crockett's story is a blueprint for anyone who has ever been told they are too new, too different, or too inexperienced to have a seat at the table. So we turn this over to you. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever used someone's low expectations as fuel for your own breakthrough? Your story is the next chapter in this ongoing struggle. Share your experience in the comments below. Let's create a living archive of resilience. If you believe in the power of turning dismissal into destiny, then your mission is clear. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We are building a community here, dedicated to the underdogs, the overlooked, and the unstoppable voices who are rewriting the rules every single day. Join us.